The dust hung low over the dry ground, turning the afternoon sun into a dull orange glow. Out in the middle of a small frontier trading yard, a tired brown horse stood inside a wooden pen, its head lowered and its ribs showing through its coat. A rough wooden board hung on the fence beside it. Someone had painted a price in thick black letters: $5. A few townsfolk leaned against the rail, laughing and pointing. One man wiped tears from his eyes as if the sight was the funniest thing he had seen all week. Another shook his head slowly. $5 is still too much, he muttered. The horse barely reacted. Its ears twitched now and then, but otherwise it looked worn down by heat, dust, and too many hard days. Most folks passing through the yard did not even slow down to look twice. Out here in cattle country, a horse was a man's lifeline. A bad one was worse than none at all. Across the yard, a lone cowboy stopped walking. His boots were cracked from miles of dry trails. His shirt had been patched more than once, and the brim of his hat had lost its sharp shape long ago. He did not look like a man with much to his name, and truth be told, he did not have much left either. He had spent the last 2 months drifting from ranch to ranch, picking up whatever work he could find. Mending fences, driving stray cattle, sleeping under open skies with nothing but a blanket and a saddle. The small pouch tied to his belt held the last of his money, $5. Most men in his place would have kept walking, but the cowboy's eyes stayed on the horse. The animal looked rough, no doubt about that. Its coat was dull, its legs were dusty and thin. One side of the saddle marks along its back showed where a rider had probably worked it hard once upon a time. The horse shifted its weight slowly and lifted its head just enough to glance toward the cowboy. For a moment, everything around them seemed quieter. The laughter behind the fence continued, but it felt distant somehow. The cowboy stepped closer to the pen, his boots crunching lightly on the gravel. The horse watched him now, ears turning forward. One of the men leaning on the rail noticed. "You thinking about buying that thing?" he called out with a grin. A few others chuckled. "That old bag of bones ain't worth the rope around its neck." Another voice joined in. "Fella who brought it here said the horse can't work cattle, can't pull a cart, and spooks at shadows. Said it's about as useful as a broken shovel." More laughter followed. The cowboy rested his arms on the top rail and studied the horse carefully. Up close, the animal looked even worse than it had from across the yard. Its hooves were chipped. A thin scar ran along its shoulder. Flies buzzed lazily around its face. Still, the horse did not shy away from him. Instead, it stepped closer until its nose nearly touched the wooden rail. Its dark eyes watched the cowboy in a quiet, steady way. The cowboy reached out slowly and let his hand rest on the horse's neck. The crowd behind him grew louder. "You're wasting your time," someone said. "That horse ain't good for nothing." The cowboy did not answer. His fingers brushed through the rough mane, feeling the warmth beneath the dusty coat. The horse breathed out softly through its nose. $5. That was the price on the sign. To most men standing there, it was a joke. A last attempt by the seller to get rid of a worthless animal before the next cattle train came through town. But the cowboy kept looking into the horse's eyes. There was something there, not fear, not weakness, something else. He straightened up and turned toward the man running the yard. "I'll take it," he said quietly. The laughter exploded. One man slapped the fence so hard it rattled. Another leaned over the rail, shaking his head like he had just witnessed the dumbest decision in the West. "Friend," the yard owner said, half amused and half concerned, "you sure about that? I'll take your money, but I'm telling you plain. That horse ain't done a single useful thing since it got here." The cowboy untied the small pouch from his belt and counted out the coins into his hand, $5. He placed them into the owner's palm. A few minutes later, the rope from the pen was in his hands, and the thin brown horse stepped out into the dusty yard beside him. More laughter followed as he started toward the open trail. None of the men leaning on that fence believed they would ever see the cowboy or the horse again. What none of them knew was that, before the next sunrise, that so-called useless $5 horse was about to do something no one in that town would ever forget. The trail out of town was quiet that evening. The laughter from the trading yard faded behind the cowboy as he walked slowly along the dusty road, the thin brown horse following a few steps behind him. The rope hung loose in his hand because the horse did not pull away or fight. It simply walked. The sun was sinking low across the open land, turning the plains into long shadows and warm light. A cool wind moved through the dry grass, carrying the smell of cattle somewhere far off. The cowboy glanced back at the horse. Most men would have said the animal was finished. Its coat was rough and its steps looked careful, like it had spent too many days standing still instead of running free. But something about the way it moved kept catching his attention. It did not stumble, it did not drag its feet. Every step was slow, but steady. They walked another mile before the cowboy stopped near a small patch of trees beside a dry creek bed. It was the kind of place travelers used for a short rest before night settled in. A few old fire marks on the ground showed that others had camped there before. The cowboy untied the rope from the horse's halter and let it hang loose. The animal stayed close, lowering its head to sniff the ground. He sat down on a flat rock and pulled off his hat, running a hand through his dusty hair. The day had been long, and the coins he had handed over in town were the last ones he had. $5 for a horse that everyone believed was useless. Even he had to admit the decision sounded foolish when he thought about it that way. Still, the image of the horse's eyes in the pen kept returning to his mind. There had been something steady there, something calm, a look that did not match the way the crowd had talked about it. The horse wandered a few steps away and began nibbling at the dry grass. It lifted its head once, glancing toward the open plains like it was listening for something far away. The cowboy noticed that. Most worn-out horses would have dropped to the ground to rest. This one stayed alert. Night slowly crept across the land. The sky deepened into dark blue, and the first stars began to appear above the wide empty horizon. The cowboy built a small fire using a few dry sticks scattered around the camp. The flames flickered softly. The horse stood nearby, watching the firelight dance. For a long time, neither of them moved much. The cowboy chewed on a small piece of jerky from his pocket while staring into the flames. The quiet of the open land had a way of making a man think about the road behind him. A year earlier, things had been different. Back then, he had worked on a large cattle ranch west of the river. The pay had not been much, but it was steady work, and he had a good horse under his saddle. A strong gray mare that could run like the wind across open pasture. Then came a harsh winter. The storms hit early that season. Snow buried the grazing land, cattle scattered, and work dried up across half the territory. When the ranch finally closed its gates for good, most of the hands drifted off in different directions. Some headed toward the rail towns. Others tried their luck in the gold camps up north. The cowboy had taken the gray mare and followed the cattle trail south, hoping to find work along the way. But trouble has a way of finding a man on the road. One night outside a small settlement, thieves slipped through the camp while he slept. By morning the mare was gone, along with most of what little gear he owned. Since then he had been walking more than riding. That memory still sat heavy in his chest. He glanced over at the brown horse again. The animal had moved closer to the edge of the trees. Its ears were pointed toward the open plains beyond the creek bed. The wind brushed lightly through its mane as it stood there, still and focused. The cowboy frowned slightly. "What is it, boy?" he muttered quietly. The horse shifted its weight. For a moment, everything was calm again. The fire crackled. Crickets chirped somewhere in the grass. The wide land seemed peaceful, the way it always did at night. Then the horse suddenly lifted its head higher. Its ears stood straight forward. The cowboy noticed the change immediately. The animal was no longer relaxed. It was watching something. The cowboy slowly stood up from the rock and stepped closer, his boots pressing softly into the dirt. He followed the horse's gaze out toward the dark plains. At first he saw nothing, just shadows stretching across the land under the starlight. Then the horse gave a short, sharp snort through its nose. Not fear, warning. The cowboy's eyes narrowed as he looked harder into the distance. Far out on the open trail, something was moving through the darkness. And whatever it was, the horse had sensed it long before he did. The cowboy kept his eyes fixed on the dark stretch of land beyond the creek bed. At first it looked like nothing more than moving shadows. The wind pushed through the tall grass, and the stars gave just enough light to shape the open plains. But the horse did not move its gaze away. It stood stiff now, muscles tight beneath its thin coat. The cowboy stepped forward a few paces, narrowing his eyes. Slowly, the shape in the distance became clearer. It was not just one shape, there were several. Something was moving across the trail, far out where the land dipped into a shallow valley. The figures came and went between the tall grass, hard to see but easy to feel once you noticed them. The horse snorted again, louder this time. The cowboy placed a calming hand on its neck. "Easy," he said quietly. But his mind had already begun working through the possibilities. Travelers sometimes moved at night to avoid the heat of the day. Small cattle groups were often pushed across the plains after sunset. It could have been a wagon train running late. Still, something about the movement did not look right. The shapes were spreading out, not traveling in a straight line like wagons or cattle, more like riders circling or searching. The cowboy felt a slow knot tighten in his chest. He stepped back toward the fire and quickly kicked dirt over the flames until the light faded into smoke. Darkness settled around the small camp. The horse stayed alert beside him, ears pointed forward. For a few minutes nothing else changed. The figures remained far away, drifting slowly across the open land. The distance made it impossible to hear anything clearly. Then the wind shifted. A faint sound carried through the night air. Hooves. The cowboy listened carefully. They were too far away to count, but there were enough of them to make him uneasy. Riders out here at night usually had a reason. He rested his hand on the rope tied loosely to the horse's halter. "You noticed them before I did," he whispered. The horse lowered its head slightly but kept watching the plains. That alone made the cowboy think again about the yard in town. The laughter, the jokes about the useless horse, the wooden sign that had hung on the fence. $5. And those men had looked at the animal and seen nothing but bones and dust. But right now the horse was showing something else entirely, awareness. The wind blew again, stronger this time. The shapes in the distance moved closer along the trail that cut through the valley. The cowboy crouched slightly and guided the horse deeper between the trees near the dry creek bed. The shadows there were thicker, making it harder for anyone passing by to spot them. They waited. Minutes passed slowly. The horse shifted its weight once, careful and quiet. The cowboy noticed how lightly it stepped despite its tired appearance. The animal did not snap branches or stomp the ground the way nervous horses often did. It moved like it understood the danger. Out on the trail, the riders came closer to the valley's edge. Now the cowboy could make out more details. Dark shapes on horseback, at least 4 of them, maybe more. Their outlines moved steadily across the open ground, pausing now and then like they were checking the land ahead. One rider stopped and turned his horse toward the direction of the trees. The cowboy held his breath. For a moment the world seemed completely still. The horse beside him raised its head slightly but did not make a sound. The rider in the distance remained there for several seconds before finally turning back toward the others. The group began moving again along the trail. The cowboy stayed crouched until the shapes slowly faded farther down the valley. Even after they were gone, he did not move right away. The night felt heavier now. Eventually he let out a quiet breath and leaned back against a tree. "Well," he murmured softly. The horse relaxed a little but kept its ears shifting toward the open land. The cowboy studied the animal again in the faint starlight. "You might not be as useless as they think," the horse blinked slowly, as if the words meant nothing. Still, something about the moment kept the cowboy thinking. The animal had sensed those riders long before he had. That kind of awareness could mean the difference between trouble and safety on a lonely trail. But another thought crept into his mind. Why would a horse like this end up in that pen for $5? If it had instincts like this, someone must have known. Unless the previous owner had never noticed, or worse. Maybe the horse had been part of something before it ended up in town. The cowboy rubbed the back of his neck and stared toward the valley again. Far in the distance, faint dust rose under the moonlight where the riders had passed. Something about them still bothered him. Travelers usually stayed close to the main road leading to town. These riders had been moving through open land like they were avoiding attention. The horse suddenly lifted its head again, not toward the valley this time. Toward the trail behind them. The cowboy turned slowly. The wind carried a new sound through the darkness. Another horse. A single set of hooves approaching from the direction of town. Slow, careful, and getting closer with every passing second. The cowboy turned slowly toward the sound coming from the trail behind them. The horse beside him had already locked its gaze in that direction, ears standing straight and alert again. The quiet night seemed to tighten around the small camp. The hoofbeats were steady, one horse, one rider. But the way the sound carried across the ground made the cowboy uneasy. The rider was not rushing, yet he was not wandering either. Whoever it was seemed to know exactly where he was going. The cowboy gently placed a hand against the brown horse's neck. The animal stood perfectly still, its breathing calm but watchful. The hoofbeats grew louder. Soon a shadow appeared on the trail beyond the trees. The rider slowed as he approached the edge of the creek bed, his horse stepping carefully over the dry rocks. The cowboy stayed hidden between the trees, keeping his body still. Moonlight fell across the trail just enough to reveal the rider's outline. It was a man wearing a wide hat and a long coat. His horse was dark and strong, nothing like the thin animal standing beside the cowboy. The rider stopped near the edge of the trees. For a long moment he did nothing. Then his voice broke the silence. "You can come out," he called calmly. The cowboy did not move. The horse beside him flicked its tail once but stayed quiet. The rider shifted slightly in the saddle. "I saw your fire smoke a while back," he said. "You hit it quick, but not quick enough." The cowboy slowly stepped out from the shadows of the trees. There was no point pretending now. The brown horse followed one step behind him. The rider studied them both. For a second, his eyes settled on the thin horse. A strange look crossed his face. "Well now," the rider said quietly. The cowboy noticed the change immediately. "You looking for someone?" the cowboy asked. The rider did not answer right away. Instead, he guided his horse a few steps closer, studying the brown horse more carefully. "That horse?" he said after a moment. "Where did you get it?" The question came out too quickly, too sharp. The cowboy felt the warning settle deeper in his gut. "Bought it in town today," he replied calmly. The rider leaned slightly forward in the saddle, still staring at the horse. His eyes moved across the animal's scarred shoulder and dusty coat as if checking something. "That's so," the rider muttered. The brown horse shifted its weight, ears flicking back and forth between the two men. For a moment the night went quiet again. Then the rider straightened in his saddle and glanced out toward the dark plains. "You see any riders pass through here tonight?" he asked. The cowboy remembered the group he had spotted earlier moving through the valley. The way they had spread out across the land like they were searching. Maybe they were connected to this man. Maybe not. "Seen some shapes out there," the cowboy said carefully. "Hard to tell who they were." The rider nodded slowly, but did not look surprised. "They passed through not long ago," he said. "I've been tracking them." The cowboy studied the man's face in the moonlight. There was dust on his coat, and his horse looked tired, like they had been riding for many hours. "What kind of trouble you chasing at this hour?" the cowboy asked. The rider hesitated. Then his eyes drifted back to the brown horse again. "That animal," he said slowly. "You sure it came from the trading yard in town?" The cowboy gave a small nod. $5, he said. The rider let out a short breath that sounded almost like disbelief. $5, he repeated. He rubbed his jaw while looking at the horse again. "You might want to hold on to it tight then," the cowboy raised an eyebrow. "Why is that?" The rider's expression hardened slightly. "Because those men riding through the valley," he said, "they've been looking for a horse just like that." The words hung in the night air. The cowboy glanced down at the brown horse standing beside him. The animal had gone still again, ears pointed toward the valley where the riders had disappeared earlier. "You saying this horse belongs to them?" the cowboy asked. The rider shook his head slowly. "No," he said, his voice dropped lower. "I'm saying they want it back." The cowboy felt the tension return immediately. "Why?" The rider looked out toward the dark plains again. Far away, faint dust still drifted under the moonlight where the group had passed earlier. "Because that horse," the rider said quietly, "is the only one that knows where something valuable is hidden." The cowboy blinked. "What are you talking about?" Before the rider could answer, the brown horse suddenly lifted its head sharply. Its ears snapped forward. Both men turned at the same time. From deep in the valley came the distant sound of hooves again, not one rider this time, several, and they were coming back. The rider's face tightened. "Well," he said under his breath. The cowboy gripped the rope tied to the horse's halter as the hoofbeats slowly grew louder in the distance. The men who had passed through the valley were returning, and now they knew exactly where to look. The sound of hooves rolled through the valley like distant thunder, growing louder with every passing moment. The cowboy tightened his grip on the rope while the thin brown horse stood rigid beside him. Its ears were fixed toward the valley, and its body had gone completely still again. The rider beside him exhaled slowly. "They found the trail," he said quietly. The cowboy looked at him. "You still haven't told me what's so special about this $5 horse." The rider slid down from his saddle and stepped closer to the brown horse. Up close, he studied the animal carefully, the same way someone might examine something rare that had been hidden in plain sight. "Because this horse was trained to find something," the rider said. "Find what?" The rider hesitated, then answered. "A buried strongbox." The cowboy blinked. "A group of outlaws robbed a gold shipment months ago," the rider explained. "They hid the box somewhere out in these plains while the law started closing in. One of them trained this horse to lead them back to the hiding place. Horses remember trails better than men. The animal knows the land and the scent of the path." The cowboy looked down at the dusty horse beside him. The same horse that had been standing behind a wooden sign for $5 while a crowd laughed. "And the outlaws lost it," he said. The rider nodded. "One of their camps was raided weeks back. The horse slipped away during the confusion. Someone found it wandering and sold it cheap, not knowing what it could do." The sound of the approaching riders grew louder now. Shadows were beginning to move along the far edge of the valley. "They must have tracked it back to town," the cowboy said. "Exactly," the rider replied. The cowboy glanced at the horse again. "So now they want it back." The rider gave a small nod. "But they are not getting it tonight." The cowboy studied him. "You law?" "Something like that," the rider answered. Another set of hoofbeats echoed through the valley. The outlaws were closer now, spreading across the open land the same way they had earlier. The brown horse suddenly pulled lightly on the rope. Not out of fear. It was turning its head toward the open plains beyond the creek bed, almost like it wanted to move. The cowboy noticed immediately. "You see that?" he said. The rider nodded slowly. "Maybe it remembers the trail." The cowboy thought for only a second before making up his mind. "Well," he said, swinging up onto the thin horse's back, "then maybe it's time we follow it." The rider quickly mounted his own horse. "Lead the way," he said. The brown horse stepped forward without hesitation. It moved across the dry creek bed and into the open plains, its pace steady and confident now. The tired look it had carried earlier seemed to disappear as it walked the land. Behind them, the distant riders suddenly changed direction. They had spotted movement. The chase had begun. The cowboy leaned low over the horse's neck as the animal picked up speed. Dust kicked up behind them while the moonlight lit the open prairie ahead. The horse did not wander. It ran straight toward a line of rocky hills several miles away. "They know where we're going," the rider called from behind. "Then we better get there first," the cowboy shouted back. The thin brown horse surprised both men. Its stride grew stronger with every mile. The animal that had looked weak in the trading yard now ran like it had been waiting for this moment. The rocky hills finally came into view. The horse slowed suddenly near a patch of ground surrounded by old stones and dry brush. It stopped and pawed at the dirt. The cowboy jumped down and dropped to his knees beside the spot. The rider joined him and began clearing the loose soil. Within moments, the edge of a wooden box appeared beneath the dirt. The rider let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," he murmured. Behind them, the sound of approaching riders grew louder. "They are almost here," the cowboy said. The rider quickly pulled the strong box free and tied it to his saddle. "Time to leave." Both men climbed back onto their horses, just as the outlaws reached the edge of the hills. But it was too late. The brown horse turned and raced across the open plains again, carrying the cowboy ahead of the chase. The rider followed close behind. By the time the first light of dawn spread across the land, the outlaws were nothing but distant shadows far behind them. Hours later, they reached a small frontier town where a group of lawmen waited outside the sheriff's office. The rider handed over the strongbox, explaining everything that had happened. The sheriff shook his head in amazement. "All that gold?" he said. "And it was a $5 horse that led you to it." The cowboy stood beside the brown horse, gently brushing dust from its neck. The sheriff smiled. "Looks like that horse just made you the luckiest cowboy in the territory." The cowboy laughed softly. "I guess those folks back in town were wrong about one thing," he said. "What's that?" He patted the horse's neck. This horse was never useless. The brown horse lifted its head proudly as the morning sun rose over the plains. What had once been a forgotten animal behind a cheap sign had now become the hero of the story. And from that day forward, no one who heard the tale ever laughed at a $5 horse again.